Hi, good morning, everyone. I'm Ilana Haviv. I'm a colleague of Aman's, and I work with youth in current and post-conflict around the world. So it's always like it affects my heart so deeply to see what's happening here with guns. So kind of still processing that. And I want to just say it's so exciting to me to see youth like David and others who step forward as youth change makers. And I want to acknowledge that there are those of us in other generations just trying to create a space for them to be able to step into that role much easier. And I'm so excited to introduce one of those people, Dr. Howard Williamson, who's going to share with us today. And I know I'm really supposed to shorten bios to a few sentences, but I can't with him. And I want us all to hear what he's done and what he's working on. And that will set us up to hear from him in a moment. So, Dr. Williamson is a professor of European Youth Policy at the University of South Wales in the UK. Previously, he worked at the universities of Oxford, Cardiff, and Copenhagen, and has held visiting positions at universities and research institutes in Hong Kong, Malta, Croatia, China, France, Australia, and Iran. He has lectured and published widely on young people, youth policy, and youth work. His latest books are The Milton Boys at 60, Routledge 2021, About Time, published by the Council of Europe in 2021, and Advanced Introduction to Youth Studies, Edward Alger, 2022. Transitions on Hold, published by the Council of Europe in 2023, and Taking Stock, Where Are We Now? Youth in Contemporary Europe, Flemish Government, 2024. So Howard is a qualified youth worker and ran a youth center for 25 years in parallel with his academic research. He has advised many levels of governance on youth policy issues from Welsh and UK governments, the European Commission, the Council of Europe, and the United Nations. He coordinated the Council of Europe's international reviews of national youth policy. He is a vice president of the Council for Wales of Voluntary Youth Services and Restorative Justice for All International Institute. He is a board member of Grassroots, the Cardiff City Centre Youth Project, and European Forum Alpat Foundation, the Duke of Edinburgh's International Award for Young People, and Learn About Britain. He is also the co-chair of the African Network of Youth Policy Experts. From 2002 to 2023, he was organizational secretary of the International Sociological Association Research Center 34, Youth Research. He now sits on its executive board as Senior Scholars Liaison. And backtracking to 2002, he was appointed a commander of the Order of the British Empire, CBE. In 2016, a commander of the Royal Victorian Order, CVO, and in 2019, he received an Outstanding Contribution of Youth Work Award from the First Minister of Wales. So I know I have lots of questions even before he presents, but I am going to pass the microphone over to Dr. Harold Williamson. Thank you so much for being with us today.
Well, thank you, Ilana, and thank you for inviting me, Yvonne. It's even when you just follow a couple of people speaking, you want to say something different from what you've prepared. You said, Yvonne, about a youth policy focus, and right now in Europe we have the European Commission, the European Union, looking at youth mainstreaming as a new idea, a developmental idea from where they were before, and the Council of Europe, which is much bigger, which is 46 member states, now trying to strengthen what it calls a youth perspective. So every time I see these stepping stones take place in my life, I kind of think, well, I started as a little humble, unknown local youth worker. And as Alana introduces me, it's kind of hard to recognize that that's who I am now, because I still sometimes think I'm just that little local youth worker. And then listening to David and just thinking, how do you follow that? And his powerful and articulate and poignant plea to engage and get involved in politics. And I thought, yeah, I've always engaged in my life, but I wrote a line once that said the right to criticize is earned by the willingness to engage. People will listen to criticism if you also get involved. And I think that's quite an important message. And then I was listening to David, I was thinking that many years ago, 2008, the former British Prime Minister's wife, Cherie Blair, Tony Blair's wife, Cherie Booth, chaired a small commission on gun and knife crime in the United Kingdom, and I was on that commission. And we recommended a violence reduction unit, which treated this kind of violent behavior in public space, not just in schools, as a public health issue, and tried to develop a much more preventative and early intervention and supportive response to young people who were likely to get involved in that kind of behavior. And we're in 2024 now, and many parts of the UK now have violence reduction or violence prevention units, but it's taken that amount of time. And it's taken a lot of deaths, and it's taken a lot of wider awareness and wider campaigning to make that happen. So, interestingly, David's point about get involved in politics, if you just assume you can't do anything, nothing will change. And he's absolutely right. And yet I left politics very deliberately in the 1970s so that I was not associated with any kind of political affiliation in order to argue the corner for young people wherever anyone was willing to listen. And I've remained politically neutral in inverted commas. I have my personal politics, but I don't. I'm not signed up to a particular line of thinking, largely because you will get dismissed by other political parties if you do, and you may wish to actually make arguments that are not in keeping with your own broader political persuasion. However, having said all of that, a previous First Minister of Wales, not the one who gave me my Youth Work Award, but a previous First Minister, he's a police and crime commissioner, just about to finish after 3 terms of office, former Minister of State for Justice in the UK government, very distinguished man in many ways. And I go walking with him, and I actually said to him one time in the hills, I said, well, you're the politician. You give me an answer to that. And he tapped me on the shoulder and he said, Howard, you're probably the best politician who never was one. And it was quite an interesting comment that I kind of took time to process, because a lot of people have attributed a lot of the progress that we have made to not just a single-handed contribution, but to a lot of hard work that I've put in over the years, not really around human rights and children's rights, but about giving opportunities and experiences to our more disadvantaged young people who will not get them through the support of their schools or their parents and so on. And I'll say a bit more about that a bit later. So that, yeah, and also I used to be a photographer in a music venue, and looking at Yvonne's show about the demonstration and the banners and the photographs, they are so powerful, these images and the words on those banners, and the young people and older people. As you said, it's a very diverse demographic in that slideshow. And what a powerful representation of the concerns and the protests against the gun laws in America. And it's not just America, because only last week a 12-year-old boy killed some pupils in a school in Finland that you may have heard about. I think three children were killed in Vanta, which is in the hinterland of Helsinki. And Finland has a pretty awful school shooting record that nobody's ever heard about. So it's not just the United States of America, it's many other places where weapons are accessible legally or illegally, which are then used in the ways that the protests were trying to counteract. But I want to kind of bring us a bit, I suppose it is a bit back down to earth, really. And I think I'm trying to look for her name. Taylor, can you my slideshow up, please? And because we're not allowed to use Zoom in my university, I've got to have Taylor's help. Thank you very much. Click on to the next one. We'll go pretty fast through this. You don't have to read this, of course. This is just a story that in one of my bits of my private life, I'm the safeguarding officer for my local football club. In America, that's soccer, not American football. And in my local soccer club. And a few weeks ago, a 15-year-old girl was banned for 10 matches for making what was alleged to be a homophobic slur against her opposing 15-year-old player. And I checked out, the language would be very unacceptable to me and very unacceptable to most professional people working with young people in schools and in sport and in culture. But I checked out with my students, and my students told me that they'd used this term quite routinely in their schools, not as a homophobic slur, but as a kind of insult to young people who were considered to be a little weak. And the girl's story was that she had used this word, she admitted it, there was no witnesses to it, so she could have denied it, but she did. She said, "Yeah, I'm sorry I used the expression." But she did not know what it meant, she claimed, and she was required to attend an awareness raising training course, online training course, which she did immediately. And I spoke at her appeal because the commission that had decided on her punishment were all men, were men in blazers with gold buttons, very much football men who had spent their lives in the culture and the environment, the context of football, of soccer, and they imposed the kind of punishment that would have been meted out to adults and probably still is meted out to adults for similar behavior. And I thought this was horrendous in terms of a 15-year-old girl who had mental health difficulties, lived for playing soccer, was about to embark on school exams, and she was banned completely from all connection with soccer for the rest of the season. In fact, probably for the rest of her life. Um, she did get her sentence, her punishment reduced somewhat, but the formal ban remained. And my next campaign, and I'm sort of starting this presentation with what I'm going to do next, is to take on the Football Association of Wales and say we must have a much more restorative set of processes and practices for young people who transgress the rules and transgress what is desirable in wider society in terms of language and behavior. But they are young people who make mistakes, and we have to think about how we connect them. What I would have loved to have done for that girl, before I move on to the next slide, was to have taken that young woman to the person that she had insulted. And I would make a pretty educated guess, and some people listening to me probably won't agree. But my guess would have been that she would have found that the other girl and she shared 95% of their lives in a very similar way, with TikTok and schooling and exams coming up and family life and stuff they liked on the television and what they did on their phones and so on. And the only real difference was that they were on opposite sides in a soccer match. I didn't have that opportunity. I don't know the young woman concerned. I was just asked to come in as an expert witness around restorative justice. But I do think that it's quite a good recent example of the way we still have a lot of changes to make, but we have made a lot of changes in the last 20 or 30 years that have been quite dramatic, and that's what I really want to talk about. So next slide, Taylor, please. Thank you. Yeah, I mean, it's just about my background because people often talk, I don't know whether you do in the United States, but across Europe, they talk about the magic triangle of research, policy, and practice. And I kind of was that triangle long before the triangle was even thought about, because when I left university, I did not want to be an academic full time. I did not really want to be a practitioner full time, but I wanted to be a youth worker. I was already a youth worker. And so I tried to combine a working and earning a living life that involved both youth research and youth practice. And then it was actually that dual combination that was quite unusual that drew me into the research, into the policy domain, because politicians were interested in somebody who was able to speak with knowledge from academic research, but who also engaged on a regular basis with young people in the community. I ran an open youth centre for 25 years from 1979 to 2004. And I worked on a lot of research projects in universities during that time as well. And slowly from the 1980s onwards, I got involved in a lot of policy. So next slide, please. Don't worry about this. You can't even read it probably on this screen, but it's really, I was asked once to do a lecture about my life, and I realized that I've worked in a lot of sectors that um, relate to young people. Youth and community work particularly, but also youth employment, education, criminal justice, social work and welfare, and crime and delinquency. I think I said that. So a whole range of policy domains, and I've worked in and around those policy domains, both through doing research and writing and publishing and speaking about those kinds of issues, but also quite significantly involved in policy in in some areas, not in other areas, and sometimes also working in practice with social work agencies, child protection agencies, and so on. And so it's quite an unusual sort of constellation of experience. I do not want to use the word expertise really, because I learn every single day just from talking again to young people. You can get out of date very quickly with language and with issues, and so on. But it is an unusual constellation that enables me to not only advocate from within the stuff that I believe in, but also to see the criticisms that are leveled at those things from more external positions. The best and probably the most horrible example of that was a minister, a British government minister, who once made a speech and referred to youth workers as the, or youth work as the can't do, won't do service. And I was so horrified at such a sort of blunt and bland statement that I got in touch with that man and said, you know, where on earth did you get that idea from? And we found that we struck up some kind of rapport. And, you know, as a minister, youth work was a tiny fragment of his overall portfolio of responsibility. And he actually asked me to help him understand youth work rather better. So I spent the next year and a half while he was still in that ministerial post, providing him with, you know, snippets of information when he had to make speeches about youth work. But he never referred to youth work as the can't do, won't do service ever again. Next slide, please. And this was where I kind of came into the a sort of national level policy position. It was a conference exactly 30 years ago in London, with some very distinguished people speaking, including His Royal Highness the Duke of Edinburgh, the late Duke of Edinburgh, not the current Duke of Edinburgh. And I was asked to do a kind of concluding set of remarks about youth policy. It was terrifying being amongst all these people, but I kind of got through it. But what was interesting, and I've written this in the right-hand side of the slide, that the topics that were covered 30 years ago are pretty much the topics that we would probably include today if we were having a similar kind of event, with the exception, of course, of technology and social media. However, the kinds of things that were being said in those days about how we responded or how we were responding to young people were incredibly authoritarian, incredibly punitive. I remember them vividly around young offenders. Some fairly tough custodial measures were the generally the response of the government of the day. This was the time, some of you might remember, the 2-year-old boy who was killed by two 10-year-old boys in Britain in 1993. So it was a time of being tough on crime, tough on the causes of crime, as Tony Blair said. And it was a time where they reintroduced custodial measures for 10 to 14-year-olds. So the issues are pretty much the same. The kinds of responses have evolved much more creatively, much more positively in subsequent years. And that's really what I want to talk about, this kind of 30-year journey. Next slide, please. Part of the value of sort of learning about that journey was also the study that I've done, which is described in the world as unique because it's lasted about 50 years, 51 years. I've done 3 blocks of research on these individuals from the ages of when they were 13 or 14 years old to now. So they're 63. In fact, the oldest of them is 65 years old in 2 days' time. So I've studied their lives and that of their children over 50 years and more. And it's very revealing in terms of thinking about how they have dealt with their lives and how they think about their lives compared to how we as professionals think about our lives. These are not young people who were active participants in civil and political life. These are not young people who have excelled in their education. Far from it. Most of them dropped out of school early, got involved in crime, often got involved in drugs and alcohol dependency, and have lived fairly fractured and often quite shattered lives. But they also, as I often say when I'm talking about marginalized youth, that professionally the world tends to look on these kinds of individuals as what I call the delinquents, the druggies, and the dropouts. But I remind people they have also raised families, are friends of people, and family men. They're terrifically loyal to each other. They have trodden very, very different paths themselves in terms of the diversity of experience. And I often think about what has happened to them and what is happening now to their equivalents 2 generations further on. So there's always that reference point of this group, this cohort of individuals that have been with me or I've been with them throughout our lives. Next one, please. Now, the title of my presentation, my talk, is about an autobiographical and political journey. And of course, we do have a political journey. We have, I've made it very sort of UK and Europe focused, but we could find American parallels to this, in fact, parallels in other parts of the world. So obviously there's the Reagan-Thatcher axis from around the late 1970s, early 1980s, where Margaret Thatcher famously said there is no such thing as society, only individuals. And since then, we've had the individualization, as Ulrich Beck spoke about it in his famous book, Risk Society, the individualization of society, but also the apparent end of history that Fukuyama wrote about around the unification of Europe, the failure of communism, and the sort of development of, until the Russian invasion of Ukraine, a peaceful Europe and a united Europe from 1989. I actually spent 3 years working in Berlin in 1990, 91, and 92, re-educating East German youth workers in the ways of the West. It was quite a challenging task. And then we had, in Britain, we had the government that eventually followed many years of Conservative administration under Tony Blair. And Tony Blair had said, we need joined up solutions to joined up problems. And I think one of the achievements in the last 20 years or so, 20 or 30 years, in terms of public policy, has been that recognition that you don't solve crime through a criminal justice system. You solve crime through educational policy, health policy, training and employment policy, and so forth, in ensuring that young offenders have the prospective opportunity of re-engaging with legitimate society through structures, pathways of opportunity for them. And Blair, I think, recognised quite a lot of that when New Labour came to power in May 1997, with the formation of something that was rather stupidly titled the Social Exclusion Unit. It should have been called the Social Inclusion Unit. But it did focus very much on young people. It focused on homelessness, on school dropout, young people not in employment, education, or training. It focused on teenage pregnancy. It focused on the transition from school to work. And it created a lot of very interesting policy ideas, many of which were not just visions of politicians or nicely written policy documents, but did actually come out in the wash on the ground in terms of the implementation of new opportunities for young people around the ages of 16 to 25. Things actually got rather better where I live, which is in Wales, which is, as I joke, is not part of England. It's part of the United Kingdom, and youth was devolved to the four nations of the United Kingdom. And so Wales has taken a slightly different path from England in terms of its youth policy. It does have a lot of documents, and not all of them have hit the ground. And a former, now dead but late, Children's Commissioner for Wales once criticised the Welsh government, suggesting that it was, to quote him, all flagships and no fleet, which is a great expression because many ministers were commissioning and waving around policy documents that made very little difference to the target group that the policy documents were focused on. Then, of course, we had Brexit and the departure from the European Union, which has, again, it's not so much a political statement, but has hit young people very hard in terms of the reduction in exchange opportunities. I actually had a meeting this morning with the Council of Europe about how we strengthen and re-strengthen exchange opportunities for young people. And this year in June, we will have multiple elections across Europe, including elections to the European Parliament. And that will be a huge test, as it will be for you who are listening in America, in terms of, you know, where the sort of political dial will land in terms of the majority, in terms of the governance of the United States, the governance of Europe, and the governance of member states within both the European Union and the Council of Europe. Next slide, please. And then this is a different kind of historical time frame, which is really about the policy environment. But I wrote something, Tony Blair in 1999, in June 1999, when the British were bombing Belgrade, Serbia, to protect Kosovo. And Tony still turned up and launched a policy document called Bridging the Gap, New Opportunities for Young People Not in Employment, Education or Training, brackets NEET. Well, 20 years before that, the oil crisis had taken place. You in America in particular will remember this because it was when you stopped producing huge cars because no longer was fuel very, very cheap, as the Arab states increased the price of oil. And for the first time since the Second World War, there was a sudden rise in youth unemployment. The reason I mentioned the Tony Blair launch of the document was that I walked away from number 10 with a sort of young person, a composite young person that I had worked with in my youth centre, and I invented his name, Tommy Butler, with the same initials as Tony Blair. And I started to think Tommy Butler was an awkward, difficult school dropout type of kid, possibly black, probably male, not necessarily male, not necessarily black, but 20% of young people dropping out of school at that time were black, 80% were male. So I called him Tommy Butler, but it could have been Tammy Butler. And I started to think about what would have happened to the 15-year-old Tommy Butler in 1955 or 1965 or 1975. And until about 1975, life would have been okay. They would have been re-included. They would have probably have got jobs for the rest of their lives. They may well have bought housing, but certainly the ones in the 60s. And generally, they would have stopped being wayward teenagers and they would have settled in. You in America had a man called Edwin Shore who wrote a book called Radical Non-Intervention, where he said, leave the kids alone. They'll grow through it. They'll be okay. Mark Drakeford, the first Minister of Wales who gave me that award, Mark and I wrote an article some years ago where we said that what was once benign neglect, in other words, leave the kids alone, is now probably malign indifference. If we don't help young people, support young people on the transition to adulthood, they could be marginalized and left to the edge for the rest of their lives. And that is certainly what has happened to some of the Milltown boys who were 15 in 1975. So they were the first generation of more marginalized, more excluded young people. So suddenly we had this challenge of young people not making a successful transition. So what do we do about it? I've we and I know some people on this call are very closely involved with the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, and I know that children are defined as up to the age of 18. But I was really very focused on 16 to 25-year-olds, so spanning that sort of age threshold that the UNCRC deals with. And I've talked already about the Can't Do Won't service in 1997. And we started to have a look at what do we need to be doing for young people to really not punish them for marginalization, for wayward adverse behavior, for offending, but how do we reintegrate them, re-engage, re-include them? And one of the things we started doing in 1997, the same time as Blair was elected in the Council of Europe, was to conduct international reviews of youth policy, to look at what different countries in Europe, not just post-1989 former communist countries, state socialist countries, but Belgium, Sweden, Spain. We reviewed, in 20 years, we reviewed 21 different countries. And what I wanted to do was to find oases of really nice practice in deserts of problem-oriented practice. Too often, governments and policy is made on the negative behavior of young people. I wanted to look at where we responded and offered opportunity-focused interventions in young people's lives to give them positive pathways to the next steps in their lives. And I was sort of helped with that because of devolution, because in Wales, the first Minister of Wales knew me from his time as a minister in the UK government, and we established a policy framework for Wales called Extending Entitlement. And again, people on this call are quite focused on children's rights. I did not want to refer to rights because of the age bridge between 16 and 24, that it was okay to look at the rights of the child as a model, but what did we do if we wanted to strengthen the law supporting young people into their early 20s? So we called it Extending Entitlement Supporting Young People in Wales. And what was important about that is that we wanted to try to create a culture of opportunity for more disadvantaged young people, not a culture of exclusion. for more disadvantaged young people. I'll say a little bit more about that in a moment. But 2004 is a key moment in Wales, and I was very central to making this happen. I chaired a committee. I was on the Youth Justice Board for England and Wales, and we decided in Wales we wanted to have something called the All Wales Youth Offending Strategy. And I wrote one sentence in there that young people are children first, offenders second. And this was rejected by the UK government time and time and time again. And it came back to Cardiff, to Wales, for approval of the revisions. And I did not approve of the revisions. And I rewrote the sentence. I put it back in. And it was kind of like playing musical chairs, that when the music stopped, my sentence was still in there. And since then, we've had a criminal justice provision for young people that is increasingly referred to as child-centered. Some of you would probably not believe it if you interrogated it. We still lock up too many young people, but we have reduced the custodial population of 10 to 17-year-olds from about 2,500 to a few hundred. So it's got a lot better because we've put in place a lot of preventative and diversionary and restorative practices that simply did not exist before 2004. In Wales, we have a dedicated law called a children's rights measure, where we have to test all legislative developments in Wales against their impact on children. We now have a criminal justice framework called Children and Young People First. In 2017 in Bulgaria, young people, it's kind of David's point really, got very active in making a set of demands of the European Commission, and they're called the European Youth Goals, and they're about equality between the genders and opportunities in the labour market and all kinds of predictable things that we know are very important, but were never really enshrined in policy in the way that they have been since 2017. We have two strategies in Europe, one by the Commission and one by the Council of Europe, which talk about rights. They talk about the European Union talks about engage, connect, empower. The Council of Europe talks about revitalizing democracy, access to rights, living together in diversity and peace, which is obviously difficult at the moment with Ukraine. And finally, about youth work and looking at out-of-school learning and out-of-school development. And right now, Belgium has the presidency of the European Union and is working on a resolution on youth work policy to strengthen non-formal education and learning beyond the classroom. It's easy to sort of look at all these positives, and the reason I've put right at the end of this slide the disbanding of the British Youth Council is because 2 or 3 weeks ago, the British Youth Council, the voice of young people in the United Kingdom, has had to fold through lack of resources, lack of sustainable funding, something that has existed since the 1940s. So it's not all rosy in the garden. It's not all good news, as I will say at the end. Can you move it on, please, Taylor? Thank you. Thank you. So we don't need that one. We can move straight. That's just the countries that we covered. There's the youth goals. So if you just take a little glance at that, I'm not going to talk through all of those. But you can see that they're very self-evident kinds of aspirations that all young people, or most young people, do aspire to, but many young people get nowhere near being able to sort of make them a reality in their own lives. Next one. Yeah, so I think if we think about achievements, we've created, I mean, young people will always say, nobody's ever listening to us and so on. We need more youth participation. And sometimes they know me and they know that I've fought tooth and nail and for a long, long time to ensure that youth voice is present in things that affect their lives. occasionally they don't know me and they think, what's this old man doing, sort of advocating for young people still? And I've had a hard time from some young people who really go on about we have no platforms for voice. And I tend to retort, you have many platforms for youth voice. The real question is which young people are airing that voice and on what topics. And what about more marginalized young people? Where is their voice in this process? Because it's not just about the articulate and the confident and the multilingual in a European context. We have created spaces for young people to have that voice, but also to have exchange opportunities. And this youth mainstreaming and youth perspectives that I say towards the end of this slide, hopefully will strengthen those possibilities for young people. Now, on the question of opportunities, and I think this is well worth thinking about, that one of the reasons extending entitlement in Wales was so forcefully about opportunity and experience was because I had spent 3 years in London talking with colleagues, civil servants in the social exclusion unit about these problems: offending behavior, school dropout, teenage pregnancy, substance misuse. It was about problems created by 14 to 18-year-olds and what do we do about it? How do we stop the problem? How do we prevent the problem? What kinds of interventions are needed? And in about March 2000, in Cardiff, we were following that sort of UK position on policy development. And I sort of thought to myself, why are we talking about problem teenagers? Why aren't we talking about sorted out young adults? When we look at ourselves or we look at confident colleagues of ours, and we think, what happened to them in their lives that led them to the position they're in, rather than, like many of the Milltown boys, they end up drug dependent and imprisoned. And of course, it's not a simple solution, but it is significantly about opportunities and experiences in early life, in as children and as teenagers. As David said, early childhood experiences shape what you become. And when we think about young people in socioeconomically deprived areas, in families that are not very supportive, who are not reached out to by youth organizations, who don't get the opportunity to travel, as I said rather crudely once, we should not be surprised that those young people end up as localized, racist, homophobic, xenophobic little buggers. We need to reach out to them, support them, encourage them to explore a much wider world and give them those opportunities to learn music and play sports and to travel and to mix with other groups of people. And we don't. Parents give that possibility to many children, as I'm sure we have done to our own children, those of us who are parents. But many young people do not get that opportunity, and public policy needs to make sure that we try and reach deeper and longer and harder into that territory to give those young people that possibility of remaining integrated. And where they have already fallen out of the system, we have to think about restorative and reintegrative practices, which are also about delivering better opportunities to that group. Nearly there. Next one, please. Taylor. Again, I'm not going to talk through these. This is part of the latest book that I wrote, which is really about the 10 core challenges facing young people in Europe, but probably beyond as well, which are about really the sort of what is being referred to by some writers as the polycrisis of the current generation around climate, particularly around climate, COVID, learning recovery, illiberal democracy, and so on and so forth. But you can see there's a whole set of ideas where we need to work much harder on connecting young people to the positive dimensions that should accrue from decent public policy on many of these issues. Next one, please. No, I'm conscious of time running out. So Nearly there, a couple of more slides. There was one, the United Nations held one big conference on youth policy, global, I think it was called Global Youth Policies or something. It was in Azerbaijan in 2014. And it was mainly political, big speeches to 700 people from 170 countries. But there was one professional keynote speech which I was asked to give. And the UN were quite forceful in what they wanted me to say, which is never a wise move when anyone's relating to me. But they did ask me if I could sort of come up with some key lessons from my long and diverse experience in youth policy, research, and practice. And the biggest one is reach. That public policy has generally developed quite a lot of pretty good ideas for young people, but they never penetrate far deeply enough. They never reach far enough into the groups of young people who would benefit most from those initiatives. In fact, they're often cherry picked either by organizations who are charged with delivering them. So the organizations find the easy kids to give them to, or they're cherry picked by young people who are already quite close to the action and know about it. We've got to raise awareness. We've got to strengthen attachment for more challenging young people to have these positive experiences. Conversely, when governments develop negative experiences, regulatory and authoritarian interventions in young people's lives around crime or punishments for not attending school and so on, we tend to confer those negative experiences on far too many young people. And we need to be much stricter, much more self-disciplined in restricting those kinds of interventions solely to those who really do, where we have little option but to apply them to them. Second area is about support. There's lots and lots of public policy that, and we have a whole army of professionals who are geared up to providing support for young people in myriad ways. Social workers and psychologists and police officers, and careers guidance advisors, and so on. But one of the questions is the timing of those interventions. What is on offer? Who is providing it, and when are they providing it? And often we get that badly wrong. And educationalists and lots of other professionals working with young people would benefit a great deal from looking at the addictions literature on cycles of change and when people are ready to change, ready to listen to new advice, ready to engage with new experiences, and so on. We get support very badly wrong. And meaning and relevance, back to my mythical character, Tommy or Tammy Butler, is that as I wrote in, I think, the Tommy Butler of 2005, the one who was born in 1990, that Tommy should be the beneficiary of all these wonderful new Labour, Tony Blairite kind of policy initiatives, um, training opportunities, and so on. But Tommy doesn't listen to the research evidence or to the politicians. He listens to his uncle or his brother, his older brother, or his dad or his sister. And they will tell you whether something is meaningful and relevant to Tommy's life. And Tommy will make that decision. And the whole concept of what is meaningful and relevant is often very different in a young person's head than it is in our own heads. And we need to really think about that pretty carefully. Next one, and I think it's the end. Yep. So my conclusion is that I'm pretty optimistic still. I think we've come a long way, and we have to remember that we've come a long way in terms of being much more positive towards young people, reaching out to them in much more constructive ways, minimizing some of the more disciplinary and regulatory interventions in their lives. But it is a patchy story, and it's one step forward and two steps back sometimes. There is regression. There are events in our societies where politicians seize on them as opportunities to go back to more punitive, more interventionist uh, practices. So it's not a kind of nice, steady pathway of development. It's a complex mosaic of things going on. There is a man who used to write speeches for Blair, but has formed a school in London, in Newham in London, and he wrote a book called 1 out of 10, which was about it's subtitled From Downing Street Vision to Classroom Reality. You might smile at this because in Hyman's book, he says he was doing one-to-one teaching to a kid on basic kind of history. And he was talking about Churchill. And Peter Hyman, the teacher, was waxing lyrical about Winston Churchill, but just calling him Churchill. And then realizing the young man, the boy of 15 or something, didn't appear to have any clue about what he was talking about. And then suddenly Hyman realized that the only Churchill known to the boy was an advertising dog. You probably don't have it in America, but there is an insurance company called Churchill Insurance, and there's an advertising dog that promotes this particular insurance company. So Hyman was basically saying that you need to stabilize policy. You need a policy framework that has some kind of longevity, whereas politicians always want bright, shiny new toys to play with. And he called that the tyranny of policy momentum. There's no stability. Everybody's panic stricken. There's going to be more change. As Aristotle said, if you want to give the illusion of change, you reorganize. The most important thing that professionals working with young people need is some kind of confidence that the kind of practice that they are developing not will not be cast in stone forever, but will at least have some kind of durability so that they can develop it and improve it over time with different groups of young people. And very finally, because it is the 2024 and the year of European and national elections, we do have difficulties with some countries in Europe, not least Hungary, but also Slovakia, where there is a very, very strong likelihood that the center right governance of Europe will move more significantly to the right, that the culture wars are being won by people on the political right, especially the political far right. And so many of you may not know, but Poland, for example, until the election of Donald Tusk very recently, was proudly proclaiming that it had gay-free zones, where they got rid of all homosexuals in a particular community. And so there is a significant risk of massive backlashes against some of the progress that I'm sure everybody on this call has been involved in, and I've certainly been proud to be part of. And there is a risk of that backlash, and we have to think very deeply about how we can counteract that by much more unity and solidarity in a more progressive and more liberal way of moving forward in policies, not just for young people, but for all people, but for me, particularly for young people. Thank you very much. Here we are.
Thank you so much, Howard. Gosh, you've shared so much. You've had such an incredible journey. And I can't wait to take a look and read some of your earlier publications. It's fascinating. Sorry, especially I'm looking at all my notes about the Milton boys. Everything takes a long time, right? Everything just takes a long time to really have effect and really have research and really be able to make change. And so I personally thank you. We have two questions that I'm going to share with you, and then I'm going to question. But there's a question from Matthew Swino. I don't see him on here, so I don't know where these questions are coming from, but here we go. I think this was in connection to your story about the female footballer.
Oh, yeah.
He wrote, would it be appropriate to have young people represented on these panels, seeing as our world has changed and many old farts are out of touch with the language of that the youth use?
Yeah, well, one of the things, two points there, I think. One of the interesting things was that the finding of the disciplinary panel was addressed to this young woman in masculine language. So it was addressed to dear Mr. and her name, and then he has been found guilty, or he has admitted guilt, and he will be suspended. And I thought, this is in an age where women's soccer has grown by leaps and bounds through the Women's World Cup. You know, football, association football, was hardly associated at all with women only a few years ago. I mean, there has been women's football for many, many years, but it was very invisible. Suddenly, it's very, very prominent. All football clubs in the United Kingdom are required to have a girls' section, a girls' and women's section, if you are to achieve what is called platinum status as a lower level football club. As we have platinum status because we have worked so hard to develop a girls and women's section, and then you get this panel of men. They're my age, you know, so it's not so much an ageist remark. It's much more about they're people from a particular soccer culture, and they need to modernize their thinking. So uh, the the question, I think, is a good one. Whether you have young people, I mean, I used to do that in my youth centre. If young people transgress certain kinds of rules, I would take them into my office sometimes if it was fairly serious, and I'd sit down in the extra chair and I'd tell them to sit at my desk. And I say, right, you're me, I'm you. What would you do? And usually they're a damn sight more punitive than I would ever be. So, but I think dialogue, you know, I think the most important thing is to have a dialogue and an understanding of different perspectives. The other little thing I did want to say very quickly was because I think the comment about language is very important. A young man, I still remember his name, and he's 40 years old now, and he's an accountant, and he's settled down. But he was a thorn in my side. He was a really difficult teenager, a lot of drug use and so on. And one day I took a group away for a weekend, and he was part of the group. And he said, "Can I have a quiet word? What does it take to be a youth worker?" And I could have waxed lyrical about all the matrices, about occupational standards, but he wouldn't have understood any of that, and he wouldn't have been that interested. I said it's three things. I said it's listening, and I said when you listen to young people, you have to listen to their jargon, their street jargon. Good means bad, bad means good. You know, all these things change. So a light-hearted form of listening and a serious form of listening, which is, when they've got something serious to say, they want you to take them seriously, not to be patronizing, not to dismiss it, not to tell them to grow up, those sorts of things. And the other two things were just humor. I think laughing gets you a long way, and patience, which is about when you are dealing with some really troubled and troublesome young people, you can't sort of give up on them at the first failure in your practice. You've got to go round the course again. You've got to keep trying. And that's quite a test of your own character, because you don't want to keep trying with some of them. You think they're a waste of space and you want to get rid of them and focus on some of the nicer kids. But it's the tough kid who will benefit most from you persisting with them. So language and that tuning into culture, context, experience, patiently waiting to understand a bit more, patiently renewing good offers, positive experiences, I think is important. And if I was on that panel, going back to the football, the soccer, yes, I would be saying, let's have a player representative from the youth section, the grassroots section, on the panel.
And that makes so much sense, right? That just seems like that should be already. It's so strange that
Yeah.
it is.
Yeah,
Um,
it might be a start to have a woman on the panel as well.
right. And there's that. And Matthew really appreciates your answer. He says, I love your answer. Thank you. And FYI, I'm a fellow at the center. So thank you, Matthew. I'm going to share a question by Benedicta Agustievo. She asks, how do you see social exclusion during your early studies as compared to now?
Well, I mean, it's that question of reach. I think there was probably less social exclusion in the more buoyant economic times of the 50s and 60s for young people. I mean, somebody, a famous sociologist, wrote a book called The Teenage Consumer, which was about the affluence of the teenager. They were earning lots of money, they were getting into music and scooters and motorbikes and all those sorts of things. I think then there was a period of social exclusion for teenagers, a much harder transition from school to work. So, I mean, obviously, school leaving age is different in different countries. In the UK, it was 16 at the time. So, young people were struggling between 16 and 21, let's say, to land adult type jobs. They were more in entry level jobs, chopping and changing. That was really where I got interested in following the Milltown Boys further into their lives, because academics were writing lots of books about everything's stabilized by the time they're 18, and this was rubbish. I mean, everything kept changing. The real issue is in recent years, once you are marginalized, perhaps at 12 or 13 or 14, because you've left school, because of family breakdown, lots and lots of reasons, the odds of you remaining marginalized are so much greater. And that's the big worry, that the killer fact when we were doing one piece of research for the social exclusion unit, that if you were not in employment, education or training age 16, and this was from the 1970 birth cohort study, so that would have been in 1986, if you were NEET aged in 1986, you were 8.5 times more likely to be unemployed, divorced, mental with mental health issues at age 26 in 1996. So the lifetime cost to the state of long-term exclusion is quite horrendous. And that's why we need to work much harder about trying to make sure that stronger barriers are placed to stop people falling out of the system in their teenage years, and stronger, bigger bridges are built to help older teenagers return to mainstream pathways to adulthood.